Harness maker Greg Hunt began working with leather during the 1960s. That was his belt era, as he called it. Friends of his, who were carriage driving enthusiasts, encouraged him to graduate from belts and purses to harness, and the rest, as they say, is history. Greg hails from Colgate, Wisconsin, and he'll talk about the do's and don'ts of harness.
Okay, we're on. We're live. Don't you make any mistakes. I'll try not to. Okay, my talk is, I guess, on harness. And what I'd like to do is just go through some general, well, I guess my points of view of harness making, things for you to look out for, things that I might have problem as a harness maker so that you can be a little bit kinder to us when you call up and have those complaints or problems. And then at the end, since I see so many new faces here, there'll be a nice long period of question and answers, you know, on general questions that you've had burning in the back of your mind and needed to ask somebody who at least looks like he knows what he's talking about. Harness. There are all kinds, all makes, all models. For a person entering into this new world of harness driving, you can find anything from a nylon harness all the way up to your top-of-the-line show harness. And each one of the harnesses has, I'd say, its value, its place, in terms of either monetary expenditure on your part or its value in terms of its use. You can't expect a show harness to be a logging harness. It's any more than you can expect a Ferrari to be a tractor. And that's the kind of approach you have to have. Unfortunately, that may mean that you have to buy more than one harness for the particular uses that you want to have it being used on. And this, I realize, is an expenditure. It's an outlay. If harness is taken care of properly, really, if it's taken care of, I won't even use the word properly, because really, if it's taken care of, you're putting some effort into it, it will last. If you just neglect it, abuse it, it's not going to last. You're going to lose your investment. But in terms of the specific use, you may have a single horse to a pleasure vehicle. That's one style of harness, one type of harness. You may have a pair of horses to a servant-driven vehicle or an owner-driven vehicle. Each one of these has a different style of harness which is appropriate. Now, a harness is a harness to a degree. You can use parts of the single harness on the pair harness or vice versa. But when you get to the point of being technically appropriate about it, there are certain features of the harness that need to be used for a single, a pair, a tandem, a four-in-hand. And as you get deeper and deeper, or already you're trying to climb out of the hole of the morass of all of the appointments here, you'll see that it gets quite involved. And this is a very traditional-based trade. It's a custom of sort in which we try to do things as they were done. And turn of the century, before the turn of the century, things were done in a certain way. There was generally very little flexibility. You had a certain number of eccentrics who were able to stretch the bounds of what was considered appropriate, but there still was an idea and a concept of this is the right way to do it. And you can see that with the formality of these vehicles out here and what's being judged out there. The same is true with the harness. In general, harness is made out of cowhide. So we start with the basic problem today that our food cycle, our food chain, as you well know, is very meat-oriented. It's a high-production, high-volume thing. They're pushing cows through the system in weeks rather than months or years. And that has a detrimental effect to the cow hide. The hide itself is not what it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because of the feedlot systems, the chemicals that they use, and everything else. So as a harness maker, I have to suffer through to pick, select, try to maintain the quality level of the leather to begin with. It's very difficult. The fibers are changed because of the speed with which they're required to grow, to fatten up. They aren't allowed to mature. You don't get the same quality of leather that you had, as I say, turn of the century. Even Europe, at one point we were able to buy much more from Europe, harness leathers. That's going now too. They're catching up with the productivity, the systems of producing it faster. So it is a problem. There are fortunately many tanneries in the United States that are tanning in an oak bark system, which is what you use for a vegetable tanned leather. In England, they're rapidly disappearing. It's becoming harder in England and in Europe to find good leather. I think with the rise of popularity in this country, I think we're going to be fortunate to have available leather for many years to come. We've recently had a new tannery put up, which I was quite amazed they could afford to do that in Pennsylvania, and I think they're going to be producing very nice leather once they get all of their machinery going. So leather is a problem for us, and it's a problem for you in terms of upkeep. You want to keep some of the ingredients that were originally put into the leather, you want to keep putting that back in. This hot, humid weather does quite a bit to not only tarnish your brass very quickly, but to wreak havoc on your leather, the stitching, etc. So you want to put back in some of the oils, some of the tallow, some of the waxes that were originally put into the leather to preserve the tanning process. The brass now, that's another problem. You would think brass is brass is brass, but the contents of the brass has changed such that it's difficult to get a good quality brass. There are some advantages in this day and age that we've got more of the alloys, which are good. Our hames now, which are not steel hames, or manganese bronze hame, are very close in color to brass, but they have the strength of a steel, close to the strength of steel. And that's important. You don't, for instance, want a solid brass hame because it doesn't have the structural strength to it. Ideally, a steel hame close-plated is the way to go, but the process has really been lost, and it would be quite expensive, I think, to duplicate today, probably much more so than most people would want to invest in a harness. The tongues on the hardware, this would be the tongue that goes through the hole. These should really be steel on a pleasure harness or a show carriage harness. In some of the other industries, the breed shows or whatever, they're not under the same stresses and strains. They might be out there for 5 minutes running around the ring, and boom, it goes right back into the stall and it's over with. You've got a little more time, stress, weight, a lot of factors involved. You should closely examine your tongues on a harness. They should be a steel tongue. Now, there are some places that obviously don't have quite the same type of strain on them, but crucial buckles, nose bands, girth buckles, any kind of trace buckles, anything that's going to get a lot of strength, and I think any one of you can sit down and analyze those areas that are really going to get some pull on it. They should be steel. That's hardware, that's leather in general. In terms of producing a harness, you've got many old traditional ways of doing it which deal with handwork on the item, and there are many production systems that were set up. Turn of the century was rapidly expanding in machinery, mechanization, and the harness industry also fell into that. A lot of people were put out of business when sewing machines and such came along, but they were looking for faster ways to make the item, and the quantities were staggering. I think if any of you read about the carriage manufacturers in this country, I mean, they were making almost literally millions of wheels in a year. The numbers are just staggering, and the harness industry is the same. Up until 1910, 1915, and the 20s when obviously the cars took over. And it really is only in the last 20 years that some of the really large firms went out of business that still managed to struggle along. In terms of specifics of use, it's kind of difficult for me to stand here and tell you what would be appropriate to each vehicle. But as I said, many of the parts can be interchangeable. You can use a bridle on a pair of harness as on a single harness. There might be certain features of it that can be changeable or interchangeable, but you're able to use a bridle pretty much throughout. The back pad, now the back pad has a specific use to it. In a four-wheeled vehicle, just to generalize, you obviously don't have the weight of the vehicle on the back pad. So you'll see that your back pads for a pair harness, it obviously does not have that weight on it. It is a much more delicate, much more defined pad. It doesn't need quite the same padding underneath. It's more refined. I guess that's the simplest way to put it. When you get into your single harness with a two-wheel vehicle, then you realize you've got the shafts which are coming down forward onto the horse. Now, in theory, they should be lightly balanced. Your vehicle should be balanced. But there are going to be extreme moments in which you're going to have a lot of down pressure on the back pad. There are moments when, and times when I'm sure your vehicle isn't going to be properly balanced also. So it's best to have a wider pad to take that stress on the horse. It's better to have one that's a little more bulky in padding. And I think the ultimate system on a single harness is to have a sliding bearing strap, of which, well, I have one up at the booth there, but your billets which hold your shaft carriers, have a strap that go all the way through the center of the back pad. And what that allows is the motion of the shafts, any kind of jerks or pulls or whatever, to just simply shift from one side to the other, rather than having it yank on the pad and transfer that violent reaction to the horse and to their backbone. It makes it much nicer, I think, and you can see much more pleasant for the horse, and I think it's safer, really, too. Four in hands, really, I don't know how many people are to that level or want to get to that level, but there are some specifics about the harness there, too, in terms of style. You're going to be using a breeching with your heavier vehicles, which is true with the pair harness, too. There are different styles of breeching. Simple style of breeching, which I call more of a draft horse style, has the breeching coming around with a strap going down and through under to the belly. And that's a very effective system. Some people feel that it doesn't look as nice or as elegant as the style that goes up to the tugs, but I feel it has a straighter pull up to the pole that way than it does by going to the tugs. And of course the tug is on the collar, high on the collar, and actually has to come down to the martingale and to the pole strap there where it's pulled. So there's sort of an uneven flow to what we'd call a tug-style breeching, although I think most people feel that looks nicer. It blends in with the traces. You really don't notice it along the sideline of the horse. There's a few others, a very simple system called a Yankee breeching, which is found out in the southwest or the west coast, which is simply a strap coming down from the back strap, fits through the back strap, comes down through, and runs down and under to the belly again. And the principle being that when a horse is under pressure, this actually pulls his rear end down, gives him more traction in holding back the vehicle. That's a very simple system, and many of the people from out west tell me that it's very effective too. They like it. Matter of preference. I think you'll find, and if you haven't seen already, that there are about 7 or 8 books out there, of which maybe 50% of it agrees with the other book, and then the other 50% goes a different direction. So you have to find someone in your area, someone that's within the organization that you respect their opinion, their approach, their philosophy, and see how it fits in with your own. I mean, like I say, there is a lot of commonality to the principles involved and ways in which things are done, but then there are all the little variations that someone says, oh, this is the only way to do it. You have to do it this way. It's the only way that's proper, the only way that works. And you find that some other way works, well, then to a degree you've got some latitude, but it's something you have to really think about yourself. It's something I think you personally can become very involved in the decisions that you make about how, for instance, you might bid a horse where you feel that particular horse works with the back pad on their back best, you know. Might be slight variations in size of bridles, traces to fit what you think is appropriate for your vehicle. There's a lot of variances in there that you can become a part of, that you have a handle on. But there are many authoritative books out there of which you can dig around and you can make your own decision picking from those answers that you get. Fit. There are always questions on fitting a harness. And I found, well, since we do primarily custom work, that the best way to do it is to have an individual either send to me or bring to me, or I go to their place and measure a harness that they're actually using on the horse. In other words, get something onto the head so that, for instance, taking the bridle, you can see that the eyes are in the middle of the cup. They aren't up on the top, they aren't on the bottom. You can see that the nose band is about 2 inches or whatever below the cheekbone, that it's a good fit. You can see that your brow band isn't being pulled in too tight across the front of the head, and therefore pulling the crown back into the ear of the horse. It's better to have something to work with than to say, well, I think that it's 14 inches from around here to here, and you're going to have to add 2 inches for this, or I think his throat was so big, or the collar is another good one. You know, how do you measure a collar? Well, you can get in the ballpark, so to speak, by taking yardsticks, stepping back, having it go up just in front of the withers and going down to where the chest part rolls into the neck. You can get in the ballpark, but that's about it. Then you really need to have a collar that you can stick on. There's so many items on the neck that have to fit on that collar that you just can't say, well, I need a 21-inch collar. If it's a slightly laid back collar, it's going to fit differently than a straight collar. If it's a narrow collar, you may have a dickens of a time getting it up over in front of the brow on a horse. It may just not go over. And but then when it gets down on the body, it may fit perfectly. There are all sorts of very slight problems that come up, which become major problems when a horse is asked to use a collar. In other words, going into that collar, it's got to fit nicely around the neck. It's got to fit not snug, but it's got to fit in there so that when they go into that, it's not rocking on one point. It's not bothering them, because that'd be the first thing for them to say, hey, I'm not doing this driving business. Let's go back to a saddle. That's like asking somebody to wear your shoes. You know that they wear in. You know that a size 10 is not always a size 10 from one manufacturer to another. The same is true with the collar. And today there are some very good collars being made that are short straw collars. Originally, the long straw collars were perhaps the best. But there are very few people that are making those anymore. And you can get some pretty decent collars made now. So it's not as desperate a situation that it might have been 10 or 15 years ago. Now, if anybody has any questions, if you want to jump in at any time, that might be the better way to do it, too. Excuse me? Yeah, this is a set of harness that's using old hardware from an old set, and it was made custom for a woman in Wisconsin, Ann Friend, and it has a crest or a monogram that was a crest that belonged to a gentleman in New Jersey. I believe the name was Coogan, who was a well-known coaching man at that time. So this has some historical significance to it. The monograms and initials are, within reason, are very appropriate for someone to put on a harness. This is a fairly large one, but like I say, this has some historical importance to it and some value from that respect. You want to keep that type of thing smaller, more discreet perhaps, initials, any kind of an emblem that you might put on it. Crests and that type of thing were traditionally a heraldry, were something that were given to a family, and it's not necessarily appropriate for anyone to use them, but I don't know how much the judges will follow along with that now. People just simply like to have some brass up in there to spark up the face drop and blinds.
Could you explain how those emblems are attached?
Right. These have, well, probably this has 3, maybe 4 pins which are soldered, silver soldered to the back of it, and are brought through the cup. There's a metal cup in here. In other words, this will take a lot of abuse. It keeps that form and that shape. They're put through there, drilled through, and then bent over on the back. If it's done during the process of construction, you'll get no marks on the inside. Unfortunately, that's not always how these things are done. Sometimes the horse is put after the cart, so you might sometimes see a little bit of brass on the inside here where it's pushed through and it's bent over. It can be done rather obscurely, and in some respects that also helps to keep the leather tight on the inside here. Sometimes this stuff will shrink away, and it'll give you less of a cup on there. But that's how they're done. Yeah.
This calves and doesn't go all the way over. I know if you put it in your butt.
Okay. This is a little different style. I believe it originated, I'm told, Cynthia Hayden, the famous, the well-known Hackney trainer in England, came up with this system of hanging the cavesson up in here, or the noseband. It's a strap which runs up in behind, and it goes and it buckles to the top buckle on your blinds or your cheeks. It goes through the tongue, right, and it's a very thin strap, and it can be pulled up and around and put back through the keepers here to adjust up and down. It's a very nice system because it also has a keeper here, which helps keeping the noseband a little more rigid rather than having that noseband float up and back or forth on the nose. Keeps it a little more in line. It also keeps it as one separate, or I should say one piece of the harness rather than having two separate pieces. While having to look for it, or it also gives it less bulk up in the top of the crown. You figure those up in the crown here, they've got to go somewhere. They either go forward or back. It looks cleaner, looks neater. It works quite well. There are some other systems of which they have a keeper on the noseband, of which the cheek goes down through the keeper, back up through the keeper, and that holds it fairly rigid too. Some people feel that that's a little better system, even more secure system, because then you don't get the flex. When your bit is in use here, you don't get quite the same twisting and displacement of your cheek pieces when you're using the bit. It looks nice. It works quite well. But it's limiting when you get a noseband that has a slot in the noseband. In other words, then you're determined exactly where you're going to be. And that may pull your cheeks or your blinds forward, or it may pull them back. So that's, again, something, whereas if you're having a custom made, you might decide that that's a very secure system. It is, but then you're going to need to know the measurement between your cheeks there in order to get that exactly where you want it. And as I was saying with measurements, that's very tricky. If I can just explain, well, I think the back strap probably shows what I'm talking about best. When it comes to measuring a back strap, one can see, if I pull this out quickly here, that any billet, these are called billets at the end, girth billets, any kind of a strap that buckles back into a buckle is called a billet. Any billet of this nature is difficult to work with. There's my adjusted length. It looks fine. It looks appropriate. It's right in the last keeper. That's what you want. You've got some holes of adjustment. But in theory, this is where you want to be, and every one of your harnesses at home should be right here. Now, in reality, we know that this is what happens, or this is what happens. Now, the thing you've got to understand is for every inch of adjustment here, you have 2 inches of billet. Because what you're doing is you're coming around like this. So that inch is 2 inches. So this magnifies itself out of proportion very, very quickly. In other words, if you give me a measurement and you say, geez, I think it's 34 inches, and it ends up being 32 and a half or whatever, all of a sudden you're an inch and a half short, or it says, say, long. You're going to end up with 3 inches of billets here before you know it. And you can say, boy, that harness maker sure was a lousy measurer. Well, you know, it's really nobody's fault. It's just the nature of the beast. It multiplies very quickly. So in theory, you'd like to have that pulled back. Now, I don't know how many of you people are breed people, and I say breed meaning specifically Morgans, saddlebreds, or Arabs, or whatever, but you will see in their fine harness, it became traditional to the point of having little wubba-wubbas here across the back. Well, I think it just spoils the line of a horse terribly, you know, all these little mountains on there. And all it is an excuse for about, you know, this much too much billet on the back, right? So what do we do with it? Well, we do this. So it was a practical thing that ended up, believe it or not, I had to add 15 inches onto an Arabian set of harness so that they could put the little things in. I said, no. I said, that's an excuse for our too long a strap. Oh, but they've got to be there. Well, you see, something like that has become accepted the norm, and that's what people wanted. And I tried not so valiantly, and I lost. I put the 15 inches in. So now they're going around with their lovely little loops going down the back. But, I mean, I realize as a harness maker, I could say, well, you know, that isn't right. You should have a whole new back strap, or this isn't right. You should have a whole new back pad. Let's face it, it is an investment. I realize how much time goes in. Some people on the other end realize how much time goes in, and it equates to a lot of dollars. So everybody wants to make any piece of harness adaptable to the little 15-hand horse they've got over there and the 16-2 wheeler they just bought. But it's really not possible. It is only within a very small limitation that you're going to be sitting here with it. And if you're happy with that, yes, it works. Yes, it's practical. But no, the judge isn't going to be happy with it. No, it's not going to fly in some organizations. But it will work. Obviously, it will work. So you do try to make things functional for all sizes and all breeds. You try to adapt something so that this could be used as a single pad. Well, okay, it could be used as a single pad with putting some kind of a different carrier system in here or a wrap strap. Yeah, it could be. It could be used that way. Everybody wants a pair harness that'll go pair, single, tandem, unicorn, and on and on and on. And yeah, but you know, you end up with so many bits and pieces, and it becomes such a mishmash. And when you have to start taking apart pieces and scrambling in a horse show to put it back together, you become pretty unhappy very quickly about having to do that. So I think the thing to do is to approach whatever you're doing in this area and decide to do that particular thing well. If you're going to do single harness to a vehicle that's appropriate, single vehicle, then just do it the best you can. And don't worry about, well, I wish I could do a pair, so I'm going to try and make it so that later on I can make it into a pair harness or whatever. No, just do it logically and step by step. If you've got a harness that's of value, you'll be able to sell that harness. Maybe you'll be able to use that later for something else. But don't try to make it adaptable to everything. Don't try to make it the one-size-fits-all harness. It'll just make you unhappy. And as you go up in your competition, you're going to find that it is those items that will soon put you in the back of the pack. In other words, when they're all through looking at the horses and the vehicles going around, the judge is looking for anything he can find to separate the cream of the crop. And those things, fortunately, the industry has gone great strides from 15, 20 years ago, where it was a baler and twine kind of thing. And I think some of you have been around then and have seen that. It's safety-wise, it's a much better situation now because the demands are there to have it safer. Am I just rattling on, or does someone have a question?
What type of polish do you recommend to clean the brass?
Okay, polish is the stickler. Brasso is probably the favorite and the easiest to get. There are some of these paste polishes that I think motorcycle people use and some other fine silver people use. Flick, I believe, is one. There's another one called, I think it's Metalol, that are tubes, that are pastes, and you can use. And those tend to be a little less abrasive and a little less messy than the Brasso is. And a harness like this is difficult to keep looking this way. It will mellow out in age. The stitching will mellow down a little bit. I prefer yellow with the brown, although when it's brand new, it hits you a little bit harder. As it gets a little bit dirty and a little bit sweated in, this will really meld in nice. It goes well, the yellow, the brown, and the brass go very nicely. So it is a problem of polishing and keeping these things clean. But as far as the leather is concerned, this could use a Lexol, something that's non-greasy, non-oily, to keep this lighter color. This will go down. This will go down. And there are some clear shoe polishes that you can use, too, that will put a nice luster to this. And those shoe polishes have some ingredients which are very good for the leather, too.
How do you keep these steel tongues on a brass buckle? How do you keep them yellow?
Keep them yellow?
Yeah,
Well, most of
what are they to begin with?
most of the steel tongues come in are brass plated, and that plating is only going to last so long. And I don't have any simple solution other than the fact that if you keep up with them, in other words, when you're cleaning, you're going to put a film over that. You won't get the rust and the humidity affecting it. And you can also wax them, like a butcher's floor wax, this type of thing. That'll put a protective coat on it. That'll help. But there isn't an easy solution, other than the fact that there are, well, these here are steel here, and these are in very good condition, but they're kept in excellent condition. This harness was kept in a storage area. So there are stainless steel tongues, which will solve that problem. There are cadmium-plated tongues. But,
would the stainless steel count against you if you had a very fine harness like that one and all stainless steel buckles?
well, I think somebody would have to get extremely picky to realize that it was steel-plated versus being cadmium-plated. I bought some buckles from France, some very, very nice buckles from France, and they are cadmium-plated. And to the eye, they look a steel color, but they're not going to rust by any means. You'll see, well, we have some pole chains up there, and you've seen them. Originally, they were all steel, and they had to have the burnishing bags, they had to have the sand bags, and they were just constantly keeping up with them. Well, most people just give in, and they chrome them. Well, in one sense, that's horrible. In another sense, you know, hey, you got to be practical somewhere along the line. I can't imagine a judge walking up, not that the owner might even know whether he has stainless steel or steel tongues, but
I found an article here on, I cut out for you, on restoring leather if any of them are interested in it.
oh, okay, all right.
They never put water on leather.
Well, see that? Yeah, well, see, the water will displace some of the oils, but, you know, I got a guy who's just one of the nicest guys in the world, I think one of the most trustworthy horse people that I know of, was a top hackney trainer, and he swears by, he says, I always get a little water on there and buff them up or whatever, and you look at his harness, and he's had it for 30 years, and it looks super. So, it's...
And they said he used alcohol.
Yeah. Ooh, well, see, the alcohol, to me, I don't know, what's the source on this?
Restoring leather.
Well, see, now restoring leather to what level? To use it again, or to preserve it as a historical piece? You know, well, see, that's a pretty tricky business. But the alcohols will cut the grease. I mean, they're gonna take apart the oils that you've got in there.
Take out stains.
Well, that's possible to take out stains, but it's also going to take out whatever oils there are in there.
Humidity stored under, what, 55 degrees?
Yeah, yeah. No, you know, patent leather is something that people always worry about. The patent leathers today are, which are used in the top surfaces or whatever, they shouldn't be used in a structurally, an area that needs to have strength. Patent leather is not a strong leather. It's a facing leather. It's a decorative leather. But those patent leathers are a polyurethane finish now on a leather. They're almost indestructible if it's done properly. And I haven't had much problem with patent leather for a number of years now.
I have a question about care of Russell harness. I have a set that hasn't been used or cleaned in several years. It really needs attention. Has a little bit of pigtail come on. What would you recommend that I would do when I...
Well, when you get to that point now, see, this is to go against it. I mean, what is probably the biggest used soap, quote unquote, that there is? Saddle soap. Well, what do you do with saddle soap? You put it in water and you put it on and you put it right on it. So, you know, I don't know, this article goes exactly contrary to that. But I would say you should probably saddle soap it to lift up whatever cumulative dirt there's been on it, and then put something like Lexol on it, which I don't feel does as much to darken the leather. Well, see, here we are again. I mean, I used to say, use Lexol, no problem. And then, you know, I read a very large article, it was in the Carriage Association quarterly or whatever, a number of years ago. Needs foot oil is terrible. Lexol is the best. So then what does Lexol come out with about 2 years ago? I couldn't believe it. Lexol and needs foot oil together. So, don't ask me.
Could I kind of elaborate on that just
Sure.
a little bit? We use specifically Lexol products in the park and have for 11 years. The new product, which is called the Lexol Greaseless Neat's Foot Formula, was developed because the American public wanted what Grandpa said was Neat's Foot, and Neat's Foot itself really isn't available. And it's a very light formula that uses basically a lanolin base, which is good for the leather, does not darken it, but does supple it up very quickly. The Greaseless Neat's Foot formula for the rusted harness is magnificent.
So now I haven't had any practical application of it. I do know that your needs foot compounds, though, you have to be very careful, be different between needs foot oil and needs foot compound, because as I understand it, the makeup of the needs foot compound has petroleum distillates in it, whereas your needs foot oil is, I believe, from crushed bone. It's from a natural source. So there's all these little technical differences out there. The needs foot oil, I think, is harder on the stitching too. Lexol, I think, is a little nicer to the stitching. Well, see, I'm a little leery of using the vegetable oils because, like Murphy's oil and that type of thing, because it's so natural and maybe hasn't been refined to the point that if you allow it to be in any kind of humid conditions, I've seen the harness really mold up with that type of thing. In other words, it's reacting and it just gives it food, I guess, to grow. There was another question over. Well, I'm told that if you mix up a very light solution of vinegar in water, and we'll go over the harness, that will neutralize, that will destroy whatever item that there is on there that the mold thrives on. But then I think you'd need to also go back with some Lexol or whatever to put something back in again, too. Were there any other questions?
What would your opinion be of using lanolin on leather?
Well, you've got silicones and these lanolin, glycerins. The silicones you have to be careful of, especially, I guess, on the patent leather. They're somewhat destructive to the patent leather. I really don't know that much about the lanolins. I know that there are some soaps that have the lanolins in it. The funny part of this is I thought I was going to be a real bright fellow, and I called up the tannery and I said, what should I tell people to put back into their harness? And I thought, geez, these guys ought to know, right? They make the leather. They put into it, in theory, what should be in it. They should know what should be replaced. I said, oh, there's a lot of products out there. And I went, okay. And I pushed and I pulled, and I couldn't get any answer. So it's very frustrating. You know, people you would assume should have some authoritative answers on it, they don't. They don't. They really don't. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Amish still taking the things and just dunking them in the needs foot oil, leaving them for 5 minutes or whatever, and then pulling them out and letting them drip dry. Well, for their applications, perhaps that's the best thing to do. But I don't think for the show work you'll ever get the polish, the gloss, the look to it. And some of the leathers that the Amish use, too, have things which are great in it for their use. They'll stand up. They'll be around probably 50 years from now because they've got a lot impregnated with waxes and oils and things, but you won't get a show finish on that. You'll never get that leather to look really top that way. Any other?
Have you had any experience with linseed oil and beeswax mixed as a base? Find any detrimental effects?
I haven't. I've never used that. Never heard anybody that has, but I think that it might be all right. I really don't know.
Those wax agents do a great job.
No. Linseed oil and beeswax. There's another one for you to try, I guess. I haven't. I don't know if I've outrun or I'm real close here. Any other?
Sometimes when we get into record, sometimes the chance to put that butter on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's some creams, I guess, you can buy that they use for the old shoes. Now, I don't even know whether they even have those creams anymore because, like I say, the patent leathers have changed. Well, it's some type of an enamel and a varnish. And I was going to say that people are a little bit gun-shy who have been in this for a number of years of the patent leathers today because the old ones were like a very heavy, well, they call them enameled leather at one point. They were actually very heavy layers, and they weren't even done on the grain side of the leather. They were done on the flesh side of the leather. They were reversed, probably for a matter of adhering to it, but they're very heavy layers, and when they get either hot or very cold, it shrinks or contracts, expands, whatever, and you get the cracks. You'll get it look the alligator finish that'll just drip down.
We were playing the idea of taking like paint strips and take it off.
Yeah.
In other words, to build it back, you just use varnish and just...
I think it would take some pretty heavy coats to get that depth to it, the depth on it. You know, it might be just better to go to a new patent.
I know a fellow, for this fellow's information, he took patent leather collars And they were alligated, you know, they were old collars, but they were good. So he stripped the alligator finish off
Right.
with a paint remover, and he urethane or polyurethane collar, sprayed them on or painted them on with a brush.
Sure.
Looked good.
Sure. I've reconditioned some people will come to you and they'll say, well, replace the leather on the blinds, you know, on the cup. And they don't realize that it's all hand sewn in there. And by the time you get taking that all apart, and if you have to pluck every little stitch, the time that goes into it to replace that piece of leather is absurd, really. Because then you can't machine sew it without cutting new holes. It's a mess. But I have fixed up some old Hackney blinds and bridles where I've literally sanded them with sandpaper, gotten them down quite smooth, and then I've taken a lacquer, a black lacquer, and sprayed on many coats on, and it looks good. It looks good. I don't know what kind of conditions there'll be down the road that will make that crack or expand and change again, but superficially, it was cheaper, it was easier for me to do that for him than to simply replace the leather. Any other?
On bridles, some bridles have where the crown and the brow band come together, they have like a curved setback. Now, when you get into showing, is there any difference in what's appropriate?
No, no. See, this one is slightly, has a very slight curve to it. It helps on some horses which have their ears set back just a little bit. I think if you looked at, let me just say 89%, 90% or whatever, the old bridles are all going to be a straight crown on there. You will see some where they have a definite curve that comes down as an ear notch. Now, I've made them for some Hackney ponies that just wouldn't wear their ears. They just lay them back. They had all sorts of problems. Put a nice little curve in there, get them away from the bone, any kind of problems with it, and boy, the old ears would go right up and they'd have no problem. But generally speaking, you're going to find the crowns are a straight piece across. Anything else? Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll take this article and leave it up at my booth there if somebody's interested. But thank you. I did you want to